That cold morning, no one expected an act of compassion to change everything. What started as another quiet day near the reserve became a story the whole town tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, every roar and every breath matters, because behind every white tiger there is a story worth saving. The frost clung to the edges of the old wooden fence like a fragile promise, the kind that breaks under the weight of winter's indifference. Elena Harper had woken before dawn, as she always did, in her small cabin on the outskirts of Willow Creek, a forgotten town hugging the boundary of the National Wildlife Reserve. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, carried on a wind that whispered through the bare branches outside her window. She pulled on her worn coat, the one with patches at the elbows from years of mending, and stepped out onto the porch, her boots crunching softly against the thin layer of ice. It was just another routine morning. Eleanor fed the chickens in the coop behind the house, their clucks a familiar rhythm against the silence of the forest. At 42, she lived alone now, the cabin a quiet echo of the life she'd once shared with her husband before the accident took him 3 years ago. The reserve was her neighbor, its vast expanse of evergreens and hidden trails, a constant presence, both comforting and isolating. She worked part-time at the local diner, serving coffee to loggers and rangers who passed through, but her real solace came from the land, the way it held its secrets without judgment. As she turned back toward the house, a faint sound stopped her. Not the wind, not the distant call of a crow, but something softer, more desperate. A whimper muffled by the underbrush along the tree line. Eleanor froze, her breath visible in the chill air. She scanned the shadows where the forest met her yard, the ground dusted with the first snow of the season. There, half hidden by a cluster of ferns heavy with frost, she saw them. 4 small bundles of fur huddled together, their tiny bodies trembling against the cold. Puppies, she thought at first, abandoned, left to fend for themselves on the edge of the wild. Her heart clenched, a familiar ache rising in her chest, the same one that had gripped her when she'd found the stray cat last spring, or the injured bird that had flown into her window. She approached slowly, her steps deliberate, hands outstretched as if to calm the air itself. The largest of the 4 lifted its head, eyes wide and pale blue, like chips of winter sky. It let out a weak mewl, not quite a bark, its siblings stirring beside it, their coats a soft, unusual white, dusted with faint stripes that blended into the snow. Elena knelt, the cold seeping through her knees, and gathered them one by one into her arms. They were lighter than she expected, their bodies warm but fragile, ribs pressing against her palms like delicate bars. No collars, no tags, just these lost souls, eyes pleading in a way that tugged at something deep within her. "Shh, it's okay," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. She carried them inside, the door creaking shut behind her, sealing out the indifferent world. The cabin's warmth enveloped them like a hesitant embrace. Elena laid the bundles on an old blanket by the fireplace, stoking the embers until flames danced and cast flickering shadows on the walls. She examined them closer now, under the soft glow of a lantern. They weren't like any puppies she'd seen. Their fur was thicker, almost luxurious, with a sheen that caught the light oddly. Their paws were broad, claws tiny but sharp, and when one nuzzled against her hand, its tongue rasped gently, not the wet lap of a dog, but something wilder. Still, she pushed the thought aside. Strays came in all shapes, especially near the reserve where wolves and coyotes roamed. These were just pups, scared and alone, much like she'd felt after the funeral. She warmed milk on the stove, mixing in a bit of egg yolk, as she'd read in an old book on animal care. Feeding them was a quiet ritual, their small mouths suckling greedily from the bottle she fashioned from a dropper. One by one, they drank, their breaths steadying, eyes fluttering shut in exhausted relief. Elena watched, her own breath hitching at the sight, the way the largest one, whom she mentally named Snow for her pristine coat, pressed against her side, seeking warmth. The others followed, curling into a pile, their soft rises and falls sinking with the crackle of the fire. Word spread slowly in Willow Creek, as it always did in a town where secrets travelled on the wind. By midday, her neighbour, old Mr. Harlan from the farm down the road, stopped by with a bag of kibble. "Heard you got yourself some mutts," he grumbled through his beard, peering at the bundle from the doorway. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of unease crossing his weathered face. "Funny-looking things, white as ghosts. You sure they ain't some kind of hybrid from the reserve? Ranger's been talking about poachers up there." Elena shook her head, keeping her voice even. "Just puppies, Harlan. Someone's pets probably dumped when times got hard." She didn't mention the oddness, the way their eyes seemed to hold an ancient knowing, or how Snow had pawed at her hand with a gentleness that felt almost deliberate. Harlan shrugged, leaving the food but casting one last doubtful glance before driving off in his rusty truck, the engine rumbling into the distance. As the days blurred into weeks, Elena's routine shifted around her new charges. She built a pen in the corner of the living room, lined with straw and blankets, watching them grow. They tumbled and played with a quiet intensity, their movements fluid, almost graceful, not the clumsy romps of typical pups. Snow led the pack, her pale form darting between the others, nipping playfully but never drawing blood. Elena named the rest, Frost for the smallest, with a white patch over one eye, Blaze for the bold one with hidden stripes that showed in the sunlight, and Whisper, the quietest, who preferred to watch from the shadows. Mornings became a symphony of soft sounds, the patter of paws on the floorboards, the contented rumble in their throats that wasn't quite a purr or a growl. Eleanor found herself talking to them during long evenings, sharing stories of her life, the hikes she'd taken with her husband along the reserve trails, the dreams they'd whispered about starting a family that never came. "You're my little family now," she'd say, stroking their fur, feeling the steady beat of their hearts against her palm. In their presence, the cabin felt less empty, the silence less oppressive. But doubts lingered in the quiet moments. At night, when the wind howled outside, she'd lie awake, listening to their breaths, wondering about their origins. The reserve was home to rare whites, tigers, elusive and protected, their numbers dwindling from habitat loss and worse. "Poachers," Harlan had said. The thought sent a chill through her, but she dismissed it. These were too small, too dependent. "Puppies," she insisted to herself. Even as their growth quickened, bodies stretching longer, muscles hinting at a power yet to unfold. One evening, as snow fell heavier outside, blanketing the world in white, Elena sat by the fire with Snow in her lap. The cub, Pup, nuzzled her neck, a low vibration humming from her chest. Elena's hand trembled slightly, tracing the faint stripes emerging on her flank. "What are you, really?" she whispered, her voice lost in the fire's crackle. The answer hovered in the air, unspoken, as the night deepened. In Willow Creek, compassion had taken root, but the truth waited, patient as the forest itself. The weeks stretched into a fragile rhythm, each day weaving Elena deeper into the quiet demands of her unexpected family. The cabin, once a hollow shell of memories, now pulsed with life. Soft scuffles across the floorboards, the occasional playful tussle that ended in contented sighs. Snow, the boldest, had taken to following Elena from room to room, her pale form a shadow at her heels, eyes tracking every movement with an intensity that bordered on vigilance. The others, Frost, Blaze, and Whisper, grew alongside her, their bodies filling out with a sleekness that made Elena's old dog-eared book on strays feel inadequate. They lapped up the milk she'd warmed, then graduated to softened meat scraps from the diner, their jaws working with a precision that hinted at something beyond domestic hunger. Outside, winter tightened its grip on Willow Creek. The reserve's edge loomed closer under blankets of snow, the evergreens bowing under the weight like sentinels guarding unspoken secrets. Elena's shifts at the diner grew longer to cover the cost of formula and blankets, but the tips from curious locals helped. Word of the ghost puppies had trickled through the town like meltwater, whispers at the counter, sidelong glances when she passed. Most chalked it up to her soft heart, the widow Harper taking in strays again. But not everyone saw it that way. It was a mid-February afternoon, the sky a bruised grey, when the first real judgment arrived. Dr. Elias Grant, the town's only vet, pulled up in his mud-splattered SUV, summoned by Elena's hesitant phone call. She'd noticed Frost limping 2 days prior, a slight hitch in her step after a romp in the yard. Nothing dramatic, just a tenderness in her paw that made the cub hold back, watching her siblings with wide, unblinking eyes. Elena had cleaned it herself, but doubt gnawed at her. Better safe, she thought, as she opened the door to the vet's knock. Dr. Grant was a wiry man in his 50s, with calloused hands from years of tending farm animals and the occasional lost pet. He carried his black bag like an old friend, but his face tightened as he stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin clashing with the chill clinging to his coat. The cubs stirred in their pen, sensing the newcomer. Snow rose first, hackles subtly lifting, a low rumble vibrating in her throat, not aggressive but wary, like the forest itself assessing a threat. "Let's see these pups of yours," Grant said, his voice gruff but not unkind. He knelt by the pen, gloved hands reaching for Frost. Elena hovered nearby, arms crossed against her chest, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and wet fur. The vet examined the limping cub gently, prodding her paw, listening to her breath with a stethoscope. Frost submitted quietly, her blue eyes fixed on Eleanor, as if drawing strength from her presence. The others watched, bodies tense, a silent pack united in their curiosity. "Nothing broken," Grant muttered after a moment, wrapping the paw in a soft bandage. "Sprain, probably from roughhousing. Keep her off it for a week." He straightened, wiping his hands, but his gaze lingered on the group. The unusual white coats, the broad heads, the way Blaze's tail flicked with a deliberate swish rather than a wag. "These aren't ordinary mutts, Eleanor. Where'd you say you found them?" "Edge of the woods," she replied softly, avoiding his eyes. "Just left there, like I told you." He nodded slowly, but skepticism etched lines around his mouth. "Near the reserve, huh? We've had reports. Poachers skirting the boundaries. White tigers up there rare as hen's teeth. Folks say they're bad luck drawing trouble." He paused, glancing at the cubs again. Snow met his stare, unyielding, her breath steady and deep. "These look off. Too big for their age, maybe. If they're hybrids, could be dangerous down the line. Wild blood doesn't mix well with folks." Elena's throat tightened, a flicker of defensiveness rising. "They're not dangerous. They've been gentle as lambs." Grant shrugged, packing his bag. "Compassion's fine, but don't let it blind you. Town's got enough problems without exotic strays causing a stir. If they turn feral—" He trailed off, the implication hanging in the air like frost. As he left, his truck crunching away down the snowy drive, Eleanor knelt by the pen, her hand slipping through the slats to stroke Frost's bandaged paw. The cub nuzzled her fingers, a soft vibration humming against her skin. Silence settled, broken only by the wind rattling the windows, but in that quiet, judgment echoed. Unseen eyes from the town weighing her choice. The days that followed carried that weight. At the diner, conversations hushed when she entered, forks pausing mid-air. Old Mrs. Leland, a regular with her endless cups of tea, cornered her one evening behind the counter. "Heard about your white ghosts," she said, her voice a conspiratorial hiss. "Harlan says they're from the reserve. Cursed, maybe. Best to let nature take 'em. Interfering with wild things brings sorrow." Her eyes, sharp behind thick glasses, held a mix of pity and warning. Elena nodded politely, pouring coffee with steady hands, but inside the words burrowed like cold roots. Was she inviting sorrow? The accident that took her husband flashed unbidden, tires on black ice, the crunch of metal. She'd survived. Was this her way of atoning or just delaying the inevitable? Yet in the cabin's sanctuary, doubt warred with something fiercer. The cubs thrived despite it all. Blaze grew bolder, leaping at shadows with a grace that made Elena smile despite herself. Whisper, ever the observer, would curl at her feet during evenings by the fire, her warmth a quiet anchor. And Snow became the heart of it, her presence a steadying force. One night, as a storm battered the roof with sleet, Elena woke to find the largest cub pressed against her bed, eyes glowing faintly in the dark, not invasive but protective, as if sensing the turmoil in her sleep. She reached down, fingers threading through soft fur, and whispered, "You're safe here. We all are." But growth brought changes. By early March, the thaw began, mud seeping into the yard, and the cubs' appetites sharpened. They tore at raw meat now, jaws strong and precise, their play turning from tumbles to mock hunts, stalking socks across the floor with focused intensity. Elena noticed the shifts, longer legs, emerging fangs that glinted white, a rumble in their throats that deepened into something primal. She scoured library books in secret, borrowing volumes on wildlife from the reserve's outreach center. The images stared back, white tigers, majestic and rare, their eyes holding the same ancient plea. Her pulse quickened, but she pushed it down. Puppies, she told herself, even as Snow's paw, once small in her hand, now spanned her palm fully. The emotional pull tightened like a gathering storm. Feeding them one crisp morning, as sunlight filtered through the frost-laced windows, Elena paused with the bowl in her lap. Frost, recovered but favoring her paw still, limped closer, her breath a warm puff against Elena's knee. The others gathered, a circle of white against the worn rug, their eyes locking onto hers, not demanding, but trusting. In that moment, tears pricked her eyes unbidden. "If you're not what I think," she murmured, voice breaking the silence, "then what have I brought into my life?" The cubs didn't answer. But Snow leaned in, her head resting heavily on Elena's thigh, a silent vow amid the thawing world outside. Town whispers grew louder, an undercurrent of fear threading through Willow Creek. The ranger, Tom Riley, stopped by unannounced one afternoon, his uniform dusted with trail dirt. "Heard about the fines," he said, peering past her into the cabin. "White coats like that. Could be escapees or worse. Reserve is on alert. Poachers hit a den last month." His stance was rigid, moral lines drawn clear, duty over heart. Eleanor stood firm in the doorway, the cubs quiet behind her. "They're mine to care for," she said simply, the words a quiet defiance. As he drove off, engine fading into the forest hum, Elena turned back inside. The truth simmered, patient and insistent, forcing her to confront the bond forming, not just with strays, but with something wilder, more profound. Compassion had bridged the gap, but judgment loomed, testing the fragile piece of her world. In the reserve's shadow, the cubs grew, their breaths sinking with hers in the lengthening days. A silent plea, echoing through the silence. The thaw came unevenly to Willow Creek, patches of mud warring with lingering snow along the cabin's edge, as if the land itself hesitated to release winter's hold. Elena's days blurred into a careful dance. Mornings spent in the yard watching the cubs, her cubs, stretch their limbs under the weak March sun. Snow led them now with an authority that felt innate, her pale form bounding ahead, the others trailing in a loose pack, their breaths puffing like small clouds in the crisp air. They explored the fenced perimeter with growing curiosity, paws sinking into the softening earth, noses twitching at scents carried from the reserve's depths. Elena observed from the porch, a mug of cooling coffee in her hands, the steam curling upward like unanswered questions. Inside, the cabin bore the marks of their presence, scratches on the doorframe from playful claws, a faint, musky scent mingling with the wood smoke. Elena had reinforced the pen, but the cubs tested its boundaries, Blaze once leaping clear in a fluid arc that left her heart skipping. She scolded gently, her voice a soft tether, but even then, doubt flickered, their growth accelerated, bodies lengthening, shoulders broadening, yet they remained gentle, curling against her legs during evenings, their warmth a balm against the chill that seeped through the walls. Frost's limp had faded, but she favored Elena's side more, her bandaged paw a reminder of fragility amid their emerging strength. Town life pressed in like the rising damp. At the diner, the whispers had solidified into sidelong stares, customers lingering over pie to gauge her mood. Mr. Harlan returned one rainy afternoon, his truck idling at the curb as he leaned out the window. "Ranger Riley mentioned your strays," he called, rain pattering on the roof. "Says they might need reporting. Can't have wild things loose. Could turn on you, Elena. Seen it happen with coyotes." His words hung heavy, laced with concern that bordered on accusation, his eyes flicking to the rearview as if expecting pursuit. She nodded from the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, but said nothing. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing out the downpour, but not the unease. That night, alone with the fire's glow, Elena pored over the borrowed books again, pages yellowed and dog-eared. Illustrations of white tigers stared back, ghostly figures in shadowed forests, their eyes piercing the paper with a quiet intensity that mirrored Snow's gaze. The text spoke of rarity, of poachers stripping the wild for profit, leaving mothers to grieve in silence. Her fingers traced the words, these majestic creatures, symbols of untamed purity, face extinction not from claws, but from human greed. A chill unrelated to the draft snaked through her. What if Harlan was right? What if compassion had blinded her to danger? She glanced at the pen, where the cubs slept in a tangled heap, Whisper's head pillowed on Blaze's flank, their breaths a synchronized rhythm. Snow lifted her head, sensing the shift, and padded over, pressing her nose to Elena's knee through the bars. The contact grounded her, a silent reassurance in the flickering light. The following week brought a fragile peace, broken by an unexpected visitor. Sarah Klein, a wildlife photographer from the city, had heard the rumors through reserve channels and arrived unannounced, her camera slung over one shoulder like an extension of her arm. Tall and quiet, with wind-tousled hair and eyes sharpened by years behind a lens, she knocked softly, her boots leaving muddy prints on the porch. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said when Elena opened the door, her voice low, respectful. I've seen photos from the reserve, white anomalies. Mind if I take a look?" Elena hesitated, the threshold a line between her world and the town's scrutiny, but something in Sarah's stance, earnest, without judgment, drew her aside. They stepped into the living room, the cubs stirring at the intrusion. Snow rose first, body low but not aggressive, assessing the stranger with the tilt of her head. The others followed, circling slowly, their pale coats catching the afternoon light filtering through lace curtains. Sarah knelt, not touching, just observing, her breath catching audibly. "God," she whispered, more to herself than Elena. "They're not puppies. Look at the structure, the paws, the ears. These are tiger cubs, white tigers." The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the silence. Elena's hand flew to her mouth, the book's warnings flooding back. "No," she breathed, sinking onto the edge of a chair. "They can't be. They've been like family." But even as she spoke, the truth aligned. The rasping tongues, the deepening rumbles, the way they moved with purpose rather than abandon. Sarah nodded slowly, pulling a small notebook from her bag. "Rare, endangered. If poachers dump them, you're their only shot. But it's risky, legally, emotionally. The reserve will want them back, and the town. Well, fear turns fast." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows as if the forest agreed. Elena watched the cubs, now settling warily, frost inching closer to her side. Sarah's presence forced the confrontation. These weren't strays to mend and release. They were wild hearts bound to her by accident and choice. "What do I do?" Elena asked, her voice barely threading the quiet. Sarah met her eyes steady. "You decide if you're ready for the storm. Compassion like yours. It's rare, but it comes with teeth." Sarah left with promises of discretion, her footsteps fading into the dusk. But the revelation lingered, heavy as the gathering clouds. Elena spent the evening in vigil, sitting by the pen as the cubs dozed. Snow approached last, her head heavy on Elena's lap, eyes half closed in trust. Tears traced silent paths down Elena's cheeks, not from fear, but from the weight of what she'd unwittingly embraced. The cabin felt smaller, the world larger. The bond between them, a fragile thread stretched taut. In Willow Creek, judgment brewed beyond the trees, but here, in the hush of breaths and firelight, redemption whispered, of saving not just lives, but the wild innocence within them. As the night deepened, Elena whispered to the shadows, "We'll face it together." The cubs stirred, a collective sigh rising. Their presence a quiet vow against the unknown. "Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of courage and compassion can travel." The revelation settled over the cabin like the first heavy rain of spring, turning the world outside into a blurred watercolor of grays and greens. Elena lay awake long after midnight, the fire reduced to glowing embers that cast elongated shadows across the walls. Snow's weight against her side was a constant, her breaths deep and even, a rhythm that synced with the distant patter of drops on the tin roof. The other cubs slept in their pen, bodies entwined in a pale mound, but Elena's mind raced, images of striped ghosts in the books warring with the soft reality pressed against her. White tigers, not strays to nurture and release, but rarities stolen from the wild, now tethered to her fragile life. The word poachers echoed in the silence, a shadow she'd tried to outrun since her husband's death, when guilt had first taken root. If she'd driven that night, if she'd spoken up sooner. Dawn broke muted, the sky low and weeping, as if mourning the innocence she'd clung to. Eleanor rose quietly, slipping from the bed without disturbing Snow, who stirred only to watch her with those piercing blue eyes. She moved through the morning routine on autopilot, fresh water in the bowls, chunks of meat thawed overnight, laid out on the scarred wooden table. The cubs roused with the sense, padding over with a grace that now seemed less playful and more purposeful. Blaze pounced first, his form sleek and elongated, fangs glinting as he tore into the offering. Frost and Whisper followed, their movements deliberate, while Snow lingered circling Elena's legs before accepting her share. No longer puppies in Elena's mind, but something ancient, their presence filling the room with an unspoken gravity. She stepped outside to feed the chickens, the mud sucking at her boots, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and pine. The reserve loomed beyond the tree line, its depths a hazy green under the drizzle, whispering of boundaries crossed. Willow Creek stirred slowly that morning, trucks rumbling along the main road, but Elena felt the isolation deepen, the cabin an island amid rising tides of scrutiny. Sarah's visit had been a crack in the dam. How long before the flood? By midday the knock came, sharp, insistent, shattering the fragile quiet. Elena wiped her hands on a dish towel, heart thudding as she approached the door. Ranger Tom Riley stood there, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his face set in lines of official resolve. Behind him, Dr. Grant waited, arms crossed over his coat, and Harlan hovered at the edge of the porch, his truck still running in the drive. The trio formed a wall of judgment, their breaths visible in the chill, eyes scanning past her into the shadows of the cabin. "Elena," Tom began, his voice low but firm, removing his hat with a gesture that spoke of reluctant duty. "We need to talk about those animals inside." No greeting, no pretense. The words hung heavy, laced with the authority of the badge on his chest. Grant shifted, his earlier skepticism now hardened into concern, while Harlan grunted in agreement, his beard flecked with raindrops. She stepped aside, not inviting, but not barring, the door creaking open to reveal the cubs in the living room. They sensed the tension immediately, snow rising to her haunches, a low rumble building in her chest, the others flanking her in an instinctive line. Frost's ears flattened, her bandaged paw, now healed but remembered, tucking beneath her. The men froze at the threshold, Tom's hand instinctively hovering near his radio, Grant's eyes widening behind his glasses. "Jesus," Harlan muttered, the first to break the silence, his voice rough with unease. "Told you, Elena. Wild as they come. Ought to call animal control. Let 'em handle it proper." Tom held up a hand, stepping forward cautiously, his boots echoing on the floorboards. "Sarah Klein reached out to the reserve this morning. Photos, descriptions. These aren't domestic, ma'am. White tiger cubs, endangered, protected. If they're from a poaching ring, keeping them could land you in serious trouble. Federal, even." His gaze softened fractionally, meeting Elena's, but the moral line was drawn. Law over heart, safety over sentiment. "We have to take them, for their sake and yours." Elena's breath hitched, her hands trembling at her sides as she glanced at the cubs. Snow's eyes locked on the ranger, unblinking, a silent plea woven into her stare. Not aggression, but desperation, the wild heart laid bare. The room thickened with the scent of wet fur and damp wool, the rain drumming a relentless tattoo outside. "They're not things," she said, her voice steady despite the quake in her chest. "I've raised them, fed them when they were freezing, held them through the nights. If I let you take them now, what's waiting? Cages, tests, or worse?" Grant cleared his throat, his stance shifting uncomfortably. "Compassion's one thing, Elena, but denial's another. Look at them, growing fast, instincts kicking in. That rumble, it's a warning. Town's scared, folks are talking relocation or putting them down if they turn." The word landed like a blow, his eyes avoiding hers, the vet's oath clashing with the pragmatism of a small-town practitioner. Harlan nodded gruffly. "Seen what happens when wild blood mixes wrong? Your husband, God rest him, wouldn't want you risking it all for ghosts." The mention pierced her, a raw wound reopening. Elena's vision blurred, tears held back by sheer will, her hands clenching into fists. The cabin, her sanctuary, felt besieged, the cub's breaths quickening in sync with her own. In that suspended moment, moral suspense coiled tight. Surrender them to the system's cold machinery, or defy the tide, risking everything for the bond that had filled her emptiness. Snow moved then. A small act amid the standoff, a slow pad forward, not toward the men, but to Elena's side. She pressed against her leg, head low, a vibration humming softly, not a growl, but a murmur of solidarity. The gesture broke something in Elena, her hand dropping to stroke the cub's ear, fingers threading through fur still soft from youth. The men watched, Tom's resolve flickering, Grant's skepticism cracking with the sight of that quiet connection, human and wild, fear yielding to something deeper. "I won't let you take them like this," Elena whispered, more to herself than them, her voice threading the silence like a vow. "Not without knowing they'll be safe, truly safe." The words hung, a bridge over the chasm of judgment, forcing each man to confront their own stance. Duty's weight, fear's grip, the rare spark of empathy in the face of misunderstood beauty. Tom sighed, rain-slicked hat back in place. "This isn't over, Elena. We'll need to involve the experts, rehab centers maybe, but give us time. Don't make this harder." He turned, the others following, their footsteps retreating into the downpour, engines coughing to life in the distance. Alone again, Elena sank to the floor, the cubs surrounding her in a circle of warmth. Whisper nuzzled her hand, Frost's paw, scarred but strong, resting on her knee. Snow stayed closest, her breath a steady anchor against the storm's howl. Tears came then, silent and hot, tracing paths down her cheeks as she held them, the bond of redemption unfolding in the quiet. Outside, the rain softened to a mist, the forest exhaling, but inside, tension simmered, rising toward the inevitable clash, where compassion would be tested and truths laid bare. In Willow Creek's shadow, the white tigers grew, their silent loyalty a mirror to Elena's emerging strength, breaths mingling in the hush of what was to come. The mist lingered into the afternoon, cloaking Willow Creek in a veil that muffled the world beyond the cabin's walls. Elena remained on the floor long after the men's trucks had faded into the grey, her back against the cool wood of the pen, the cub's warmth seeping through her clothes like a hesitant lifeline. Snow's head rested heavily on her thigh, her breaths deep and rhythmic, while Frost curled against her side, the faint scar on her paw brushing Elena's arm, a reminder of small vulnerabilities in their growing forms. Blaze and Whisper flanked the others, their bodies forming a protective semicircle, eyes half-lidded but alert, as if the intrusion had etched a new wariness into their instincts. The rain had eased to a drizzle, tapping irregularly on the roof, but inside, silence reigned, broken only by the soft crackle of the rekindled fire Elena had absent-mindedly tended. She didn't cry out or pace. Instead, she traced patterns in Snow's fur, her fingers following the emerging stripes that whispered of wild heritage. The confrontation replayed in fragments, Tom's measured warnings, Grant's pragmatic edge, Harlan's gruff certainty, each word a stone in the wall closing around her choices, forcing her to weigh the cub's freedom against her own isolation. The reserve's rehab centers they mentioned, sterile enclosures, handlers in gloves, lives reduced to exhibits, felt like exile for these souls who'd nuzzled her in the night. Yet defiance alone wouldn't shield them. The town's fear was a living thing, coiling tighter with every rumor. As evening deepened, the first sign of crisis stirred. Whisper, the quietest, who always observed from the edges, rose unsteadily from the pile. Her movements, usually fluid, hitched, a subtle tremor in her limbs, her breath coming in shallow hitches, rather than the steady rumble of her siblings. Elena noticed immediately, her hand extending as the cub padded closer, collapsing halfway with a weak mewl that pierced the quiet like a fracture. The others roused, Snow nosing her sister gently, a low vibration of concern humming from her throat. Elena's heart clenched, the room tilting as she gathered Whisper into her arms, the cub's body feverish against her chest, eyes glassy and unfocused. "No, not now," she murmured, the words lost in the fire's glow, her voice threading the panic rising within. She carried Whisper to the blanket by the hearth, laying her down with careful hands, the cub's flanks rising and falling too rapidly. Frost limped closer, her old injury flaring in sympathy, while Blaze paced a tight circle, his tail flicking with agitation. Snow stayed sentinel, her pale form rigid, watching Elena's every motion with an intensity that felt like shared desperation. The air thickened with the scent of distress, a faint musk that mingled with the wood smoke, underscoring the fragility of their bond. Elena fetched a damp cloth, pressing it to Whisper's forehead, her own breaths sinking with the cub's labored ones. Memories surfaced unbidden. The night her husband had collapsed in the kitchen, his face pale under the fluorescent light, her hands helpless as the ambulance wailed away. That failure had hollowed her, leaving a void these cubs had begun to fill. Now the same helplessness clawed back, but she pushed it down, mind racing to Dr. Grant's earlier visit. Skepticism be damned. She needed help, even if it meant inviting judgment deeper into her sanctuary. The decision crystallized in the firelight. With trembling fingers, she dialed the vet's number, the phone's weight heavy in her palm. Grant answered on the third ring, his voice gruff against the static of the line. "Elena, this about those cubs?" "Whisper's sick," she said, keeping her tone even, though her free hand stroked the cub's ear, feeling the heat radiate. "Fever, shaking. I can't, please come, just this once." A pause stretched, filled with the distant hum of his evening routine. Risky, Elena. If word gets out. But something in her silence, perhaps the echo of her plea, shifted him. Be there in 20. Keep her warm. The weight was a slow unraveling. Elena wrapped Whisper in a soft towel, the cub's body limp but trusting, her weak nuzzle against Elena's wrist, a spark of hope amid the fear. Snow pressed close, her own warmth enveloping them both, while the others hovered, their breaths a chorus of quiet anxiety. Outside, the drizzle thickened to rain again, wind sighing through the pines like a withheld warning. When Grant's SUV crunched up the drive, headlights cutting the dusk, Elena met him at the door, the cub cradled protectively. He stepped in without a word, shedding his coat, his face etched with reluctant resolve. The other cubs backed away slightly. Snow's rumble a subtle undercurrent, but they held their ground, eyes tracking his every move. Grant knelt by the fire, gloved hands gentle as he examined Whisper, listening to her chest, checking her gums, his stethoscope cold against her fur. Dehydration, maybe infection from the cold, he muttered more to himself. These aren't domesticated. Their systems fight different. Needs fluids, antibiotics, if I can get the dose right. Elena watched, breath held, as he prepared a makeshift IV from his bag. The needles glint, stark in the lamplight. Whisper stirred under his touch, a faint whimper escaping, her eyes fluttering toward Eleanor as if seeking permission. The moment stretched, moral suspense coiling. Grant's hands, steady from years of farm calls, now bridging the gap between fear and aid. He hesitated once, glancing at her. This could draw the ranger back. You sure? She nodded, kneeling beside him, her hand on Whisper's paw. If we don't, she'll... The words caught, but her eyes, tears brimming but unshed, conveyed the rest. Grant exhaled, proceeding with a field surgeon's focus, the drip line securing as the cub's breaths eased fractionally. Silence enveloped them, broken only by the rain's patter and the fire's soft pops. The act of compassion, a quiet rebellion against the town's tide. As the treatment took hold, Whisper's tremors subsided, her body relaxing into the towel, eyes closing in exhausted relief. Grant packed his bag slowly, his skepticism softened by the scene. The cubs now circling warily but without threat, Snow's gaze holding a grudging acceptance. "Monitor her tonight," he said at the door, rain sheeting down. "And Elena, this changes things. They're not just your strays anymore. The world's bigger than this cabin." She nodded, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed in her chest. Alone again, Elena lifted Whisper carefully, settling by the fire with the cub in her lap. The others joined, a pile of white forms seeking solace, their breaths steadying into harmony. In that hush, a deeper truth surfaced, not from words but from the weight of Snow's head on her shoulder, the way Frost's paw intertwined with her fingers. These weren't mere rescues, they mirrored her own buried grief, the daughter she'd never had, lost to the accident's shadow. Raising them had been atonement, their wild innocence pulling her from isolation, forcing her to choose life over surrender. Tears fell then, silent tracks mingling with the cub's fur as the night wrapped around them. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, redemption flickered, compassion forged in crisis, binding human fragility to untamed strength. The reserve's call loomed, judgments waiting, but for now, in the circle of breaths and firelight, Elena held them close. The bond, a quiet force against the gathering unknown. The fire's embers had dulled to a faint orange pulse by the time Elena stirred from her vigil. The cabin wrapped in the hush of pre-dawn. Whisper lay nestled in her lap, the cub's breaths now a shallow but steady cadence, the IV line removed hours ago under the vet's watchful eye. Snow hadn't moved from her post at Eleanor's side, her pale flank rising and falling in sync, a silent guardian whose warmth seeped through the blanket like an unspoken promise. The other cubs dozed nearby, Blaze's form sprawled with youthful abandon, Frost curled tight as if shielding herself from the night's uncertainties. Rain had ceased, leaving the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine, filtering through the cracked window like a reminder of the world pressing in. Elena shifted carefully, her muscles aching from the hours on the hard floor, but she didn't rise. Instead, she traced the soft ridge of Whisper's ear, feeling the faint vibration of contentment humming beneath the fur. The crisis had ebbed, but its shadow lingered, a fragility that mirrored her own. The way grief had once hollowed her after the accident, leaving her adrift in this cabin like a ghost haunting its own life. Grant's words echoed in the quiet. The world's bigger than this cabin. Bigger, yes, and closing in. The Rangers' visit had been a warning shot. Now, with Whisper's illness as proof of their needs, the authorities would return, armed with protocols and cages disguised as care. Morning light seeped through the lace curtains, grey and diffused, painting the room in muted tones. Elena finally stood, cradling Whisper as she moved to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under her steps. She prepared a thin broth, simmering meat scraps with water from the well, the steam rising in lazy curls that carried hints of iron and warmth. The cubs roused with the aroma, padding over with tentative grace. Snow first, nosing the bowl Eleanor set down, then urging her siblings forward. Whisper lapped weakly at first, her tongue rasping against the liquid. But colour returned to her eyes, a spark of the wild vitality Elena had glimpsed in their play. No words passed between them, just the soft sounds of suckling and the fire's dying crackle, a fragile harmony in the face of gathering storm. Outside, Willow Creek awoke slowly, the distant rumble of a truck on the wet road slicing through the forest's exhale. Elena watched from the window, mug in hand, steam fogging the glass as she wiped it clear. The reserve's edge blurred into the mist, its trails hidden but ever present, a boundary she'd crossed without knowing. Her mind wandered to the books stacked on the side table, pages filled with tales of white tigers, elusive spirits of the wild, poached for their rarity. Mothers separated from cubs in brutal silences. These four, dumped like refuse, had found her instead. But survival demanded more than instinct now. It required choices that could shatter her quiet world. The day unfolded in tense increments. Elena kept the cubs inside, the yard too exposed under the clearing sky, their energy channeled into gentle prowls around the living room. Blaze tested the reinforced pen with a paw, his claws clicking softly against the wood, while Frost shadowed Elena, her limp a ghost of the past injury. Snow patrolled the edges, her blue eyes flicking to the door with increasing frequency, as if sensing the shift in the air. By noon, the phone rang, sharp, insistent, shattering the calm. Eleanor answered, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. It was Sarah Klein, the photographer, her tone urgent but measured. "Elena, the reserve's mobilizing. Tom's report hit their desk this morning, mentioned the Cubs, the illness. They're sending a team, experts, transport. Could be here by evening. I tried to vouch for you. Say you've given them a fighting chance, but protocol. They see risk, not redemption." Elena's grip tightened on the receiver, the Cubs stirring at her feet, Snow's rumble a low undercurrent. "And if I say no?" "They're not ready for cages, Sarah, not after everything." A pause, filled with the faint hum of city traffic on Sarah's end. Then it escalates. Fines, seizure. The town's already buzzing. Harlan's spreading word at the diner, calling them a menace. But listen. There's a rehab center up north, one that specializes in big cats, soft release programs, not zoos. If you cooperate, maybe we steer it there. For them. The call ended with promises of updates, but the tension coiled tighter, a medical and moral crisis converging. Elena hung up, sinking onto the worn couch, the Cubs converging like a tide. Whisper, stronger now, climbed into her lap unbidden, her head pressing against Elena's chest, breaths warm and trusting. The contact unlocked something deeper, a memory surfacing like a breath held too long. Not just her husband's accident, but the daughter they'd lost before birth, a quiet grief buried under years of silence. The ultrasound's empty silence, the doctor's averted eyes, the way she'd wandered the reserve trails alone, seeking solace in the wild's indifference. These Cubs, with their pleading gazes and fragile forms, had mirrored that loss, innocent lives thrust into her hands, demanding she choose nurturing over numbness. Tears welled, unbidden, tracing silent paths as she held Whisper close, the Cub's purr vibrating against her ribs. Snow watched, her own eyes softening, as if recognizing the shared vulnerability, the tigress's instinct to protect, echoing Elena's buried maternal ache. In that moment, the late revelation reframed it all. Raising them hadn't been mere compassion, it was redemption, pulling her from the shadow of failure, forcing her to confront the life she'd withdrawn from. The Cubs weren't just survivors. They were her mirror, their wild hearts healing the fractures in her own. But the afternoon brought rising action, the crisis sharpening. A distant engine growled closer, not a truck but something heavier, a reserve van, its tires churning mud as it pulled into the drive. Elena rose, Cubs scattering to the pen with instinctive wariness, Snow's form blocking the front as if to shield her. Through the window she saw them, two handlers in khaki, crates in tow, Tom Riley trailing with a clipboard. No sirens, no force, yet, but the air hummed with inevitability, the extraction unfolding like a slow, cinematic unraveling. Elena opened the door before they knocked, the cool air rushing in with the scent of wet leaves. "They're inside," she said simply, her voice a thread of resolve, stepping aside not in defeat but in calculated grace. The handlers entered cautiously, their boots echoing, eyes widening at the sight of the Cubs, pale forms huddled but unbowed, Snow's stare a silent challenge. Tom hung back, his face etched with conflict, the moral suspense hanging thick, duty clashing with the quiet bond he'd glimpsed before. One handler, a woman with steady hands and a vet's badge, knelt slowly, offering a gloved palm. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice soft against the room's tension. Whisper, still weak, didn't flinch, but the others circled, bodies low, breaths hitching in unison. Elena hovered, her hand trembling as she stroked Snow's flank, whispering encouragement that bridged human and wild. The extraction began in fragments, a crate opened, baited with meat. Frost coaxed first with Elena's guiding touch, her limp paw folding as she entered reluctantly. The process stretched, each cub a negotiation of trust and necessity, the air filled with soft rumbles and the faint click of latches. As Blaze was secured, a hitch arose. Snow resisted, her form rigid, refusing the crate until Elena knelt beside it, tears brimming. "It's okay, girl, for all of us." The cub met her eyes, a flicker of recognition passing, then stepped in, head high, the door closing with a finality that echoed in Elena's chest. The handlers worked efficiently, no drama, just the grounded reality of field relocation. Blankets over crates, checks for stability, the van's engine idling like a held breath. Tom lingered last, clipboard unsigned. "Rehab center, like Sarah said. They'll thrive there, release back to the wild eventually." His voice held a rare softness, the earlier judgment yielding to the scene's raw emotion. Elena nodded, the cabin suddenly vast and empty, the silence deafening as the van pulled away, taillights fading into the tree line. She sank to the floor then, the fire's remnants cold, breaths ragged in the void. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows, but in the quiet, the bond lingered, a silent justice delivered through instinct, compassion's weight lifting her toward hope. The cubs were gone, but their presence echoed, a redemption etched in the empty pen, breaths remembered in the wind's sigh. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of this white tiger reach more people who still believe in kindness. The cabin's silence pressed in like a held breath. The empty pen a stark void where pale forms had once curled in trust. Elena remained on the floor, knees drawn to her chest, the chill of the boards seeping through her jeans as the last echoes of the van's engine dissolved into the forest's hush. Outside, twilight bled into night, the sky a deepening indigo streaked with the first stars, indifferent witnesses to the unraveling. Her hands, still tingling from the final strokes of fur, clenched into fists against the rug. The scent of wet earth and faint musk lingering like a ghost in the air. The fire had gone out entirely now, its ashes cold and grey, mirroring the hollow ache that settled in her ribs. She didn't move for what felt like hours, the world narrowing to the rhythm of her own breaths. Shallow at first, then deepening into sobs she muffled against her sleeve. The cub's absence was a physical weight, each corner of the room echoing their absence, the scratched doorframe from Blaze's playful leaps, the blanket Whisper had claimed with her quiet warmth, Frost's favoured spot by the window, where sunlight had once danced on her scarred paw. Snow's steady gaze haunted her most, those blue eyes that had held a knowing beyond words, a silent pact forged in the dead of winter. Elena's mind replayed the extraction in fragments, the handler's gloved hands, the soft clicks of crate latches, Snow's reluctant step forward, head high as if marching to an ancient call. Protocol, they'd said, safety. But in the quiet, it felt like betrayal. Her compassion stripped bare and judged wanting. Night fully claimed the cabin, the wind sighing through the pines like a distant lament. Elena rose at last, legs unsteady, and wandered to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. The reserve stretched beyond, its depths swallowed by shadow, but she imagined them there already, the van rumbling along hidden trails, crates jostling gently, the cubs' breaths quickening with the scent of wild air. Sarah had promised the rehab center was kind, enclosures with trees and streams, handlers who understood the pull of instinct, a path to soft release where they could reclaim the forest's embrace. Yet doubt coiled tight. Would Snow lead them still, her authority unbroken by bars? Would Whisper's fragility find strength in the wild, or fade like a whisper on the wind? The days that followed blurred into a slow unraveling. Willow Creek's rhythm resuming around her like a tide she'd been pulled from. At the diner, conversations hushed as she poured coffee, Harlan's nods turning awkward, his earlier warnings now laced with reluctant respect. "Did right by 'em, I suppose," he muttered once over his usual black brew, eyes avoiding hers. Dr. Grant stopped by the counter mid-shift, his gruff voice softer. A herd there settling, fluids holding, no complications. No apology, but a flicker in his gaze. A vet's quiet acknowledgement of the line he'd crossed in that rain-swept night. Tom Riley passed through town meetings without mention, his reports filed away, the moral suspense of duty yielding to the evidence of survival. Elena returned to the cabin each evening heavier, the space echoing with phantoms. She mended the pen absent-mindedly, stacking the blankets in a corner, their faint warmth a cruel tease. Sleep came fitfully, dreams tangled with stripes and blue eyes, waking her to the dawn's cold light filtering through empty windows. The reserve called to her now, not as neighbor, but as unfinished business. On the third morning, she drove the winding road to its edge, parking at the overlook where she'd once hiked with her husband, the air crisp with the scent of thawing soil and new growth. Below, the forest unfolded in greens and shadows, a vast canvas where secrets breathed. Sarah met her there, as arranged, her camera slung low, face weathered by trail dust. They walked in silence at first, boots crunching over pine needles, the path sloping toward the rehab enclosures hidden in a clearing. "They're adapting," Sarah said finally, her voice threading the quiet, gesturing to a distant fence where pale shapes moved. Elena's breath caught, hands trembling at her sides as they approached, the air humming with the subtle rustle of leaves and hidden life. There, beyond the wire, Snow paced with regal poise, her form elongated now, muscles rippling under moonlight white fur. The others flanked her, Blaze bounding with renewed vigor, Frost limping less, her paw a faint memory, Whisper shadowing close, her frailty ebbing into quiet strength. They paused as one, senses attuned, Snow's head lifting, blue eyes locking onto Elena's through the barrier. Not pleading, but recognizing a flicker of the bond unbroken, instinct bridging the divide. The tigress approached slowly, others trailing, their breaths visible in the cool air, a low rumble vibrating the fence like a shared heartbeat. Elena knelt, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks, her hand pressing against the wire where Snow's nose met it, warm and rasping. No words passed, just the press of presence, the wild's misunderstood beauty reframing the loss into something profound. In that touch, the late revelation crystallized. These cubs hadn't just been saved by her, they'd redeemed her, pulling the buried grief of her lost child into the light, teaching survival through their own fragile hope. The accident's shadow, the empty cabin, they'd filled it with loyalty's quiet fire, forcing her to choose action over isolation, compassion over fear. Sarah watched from a distance, her silence a respectful veil as the moment stretched, cinematic in its raw emotion, human tears against unyielding wire, tiger breaths sinking with held-back sobs. The sun dipped lower, gilding the scene in amber, the forest exhaling around them. Months later, Elena stood at the same overlook, the air warm with summer's promise, wildflowers nodding along the trail. The release had come at dawn, handlers opening gates under watchful eyes, the white tigers vanishing into the reserve's heart one by one, Snow last, pausing at the tree line to glance back, her form a ghost in the mist. Now, Elena volunteered at the center, her hands steady with purpose, guiding others through the weight of choice. The world still needed kindness, she knew, silent connections that defied judgment, instincts that bound species in unexpected grace. Survival wasn't solitary, it was the courage to act, to see innocence in the fierce. In the distance a faint roar echoed, not of pain but triumph. Elena smiled into the horizon, imagining Snow walking free, her cubs, grown strong, trailing into the green expanse, stripes blending with shadows, a family reclaimed by the wild. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching the case of She Raised 4 Puppies for months. Then the vet told her they weren't dogs. They were white tiger cubs. See you in the next one.